we can see that there were two periods, in the last 2,000 years, there were two periods of global cooling. One of them occurred in the 6th century. It actually now can be accurately dated to occurring between 536 and 544 AD, which is a very interesting time. This was basically the time that historians have for decades said this was the onset of the Dark Ages. It's also the time during which all of the Arthurian myths and the Grail quest stories are placed. You know, Arthur's death is traditionally placed at the Battle of Camlan or Camlan, which is usually dated at about 540 AD, which basically culminated this quest for the Grail, right? What was now the Grail stories themselves were set down in writing between about 1180 and 1230 AD, in this really interesting time during the Middle Ages, at the same time that the great cathedrals were being built, when the Cathar movement was at its strongest, when the Knights of the Temple were at their strongest, when Kabbalism schools were flourishing in Spain, when the troubadours were making their circuits around Europe, spreading news and entertainment, but really probably carrying esoteric information to the initiates that had the key to the secret language that they used. It was a very interesting time. But it was in that 1180 to 1230 that the Grail stories were written down. Now, the Grail stories actually refer back to this period of the Arthurian days, and the quest for the Grail, if you recall, was that the land had succumbed to blight. It had become a wasteland. England had become a wasteland, and the idea of the Grail was the Grail not only restored the wasteland, it restored the king, because remember, the king, whether it was King Arthur or Bran or Anfortas or the Fisher King, there were different names in different stories. It was the same deal. He was sick, he was in decline, he was wounded, the wound wouldn't heal, he was debilitated, and the only way to restore him was to find the Grail, bring the Grail back, allow him to drink from the Grail, but the Grail was also the means of restoring the wasteland to fertility and fecundity. Now, here's where it gets interesting, is that the dendrochronologists who study tree rings have been looking at that period, exactly in that period that the tradition places the Grail quest, and have discovered that for about 8 or 10 years, forest growth in the northern hemisphere almost came to a screeching halt. And this has now been well documented. Mike Bailey has done most of this work, basically showing that there was a serious global cooling that took place during those years. And the historical record of that seems to confirm, because there's multiple descriptions, from Irish monks and so on, describing how for weeks at a time the sun is not visible, that its darkness has come over the land, that there were reports of these mysterious fogs, and then there are multiple collapses of agriculture. Okay, so as a result of these multi-year collapses of agriculture because of the cold and the dark and the damp, people got malnourished, and then you had famine. As a result of famine, people, their immune systems became weakened, and then in 542 AD, you had the onset of the Justinian plague, which wiped out maybe a third of the population of Europe. Whole villages disappeared as a consequence. Wow. Now, these events pretty much followed in sequence. You see, the cold brought about the collapse of agriculture. The collapse of agriculture brought about famine. Famine brought about weakness. And as a result, boom, you have plague. Now, it took European civilization nearly 3 centuries to recover from that. Now, what brought about the recovery was the return of warmth to the world, what is called the medieval warm period. And this began really to occur in about 900 AD. The sea ice began to retract back well inside the Arctic Circle, which opened up the sea lanes between northern Europe, Iceland, and Greenland. And so it was this period of time that the Vikings were able to sail to Iceland and then sail to Greenland and actually establish colonies on the west coast of Greenland and farm, where now the ground is perennially frozen. Let me try that again. Perennially frozen, right? So it was clearly a warm period. And what happened was, if you look back now at the studies from that medieval warm period, you see that agriculture rebounded. Suddenly people had lots of food to eat. Actually, studies of skeletons show that the stature of humans during this period of time increased by 4 or 5 inches on average from what it had been during the Dark Ages. And now Europe started becoming wealthy again, because the basis of all wealth basically was agriculture, was food, right? Without that, you don't have anything else. Population began to expand enormously. You see other things going on. Lifespans increase. Infant mortality decreases. All of this stuff has been well documented in a whole variety of studies.